Okay, this Hangout on Air is live, coming to you from sunny Boston, from sunny Prague. No, cloudy Prague.
Yeah, cloudy Prague.
Cloudy Prague, and from sunny London.
No, pretty cloudy.
Pretty cloudly as well. Okay, so I've left the weather behind me. So I'd like to introduce Samir to you guys. Hey Samir, how you doing? This is your first time on the VJug.
Yes, and it's slightly terrifying.
Oh, well, we're all friendly here. So, welcome to the VJug, sponsored by Rebel Labs. Today we're going to be talking about highly strung, which is understanding your type system. Oliver, how's the life of Rebel Labs going these days?
Rebel Labs is doing very well, Simon. Thank you for asking. Just a quick note, we released a report last week called 10 Kick-Ass Tools Modern Developers Love. I'll be happy to ping everybody on the mailing list with a link to that report so they can check it out. It goes over 10 tools that we've handpicked over a period of 3 annual developer surveys that we've carried out since 2012 with good old evidence and stats showing why we think these developers love these tools and having some, quantitative evidence to provide in the same way. So look for that. Look for an email from me, Oliver, and yeah, that's about it.
Okay, awesome. And you can pick that up at rebellab.org, or watch out for the email that Oliver's sending. One other thing that I wanted to mention was about Geek Out UK, the Zero Turnaround conference happening in Shoreditch, London. We currently only have 4 early geek tickets left, so help yourself to one of them. After that, we'll have the late geek tickets, and this is a conference happening on October 16th. Okay, nothing else from me. Let me introduce Samir then. So Samir is a developer in London. Samir works for Codurance, right? For Sandro, for one of our speakers a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, I work for Sandro, and I regret it every day. No, that's a lie.
I was going to say, what's it like working for Sandro? Sandro's a great guy, right?
Mostly, he just leaves me alone, except when he feels like arguing. And he's quite argumentative, and so am I, so we argue a lot, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was going to say, Sandro is quite argumentative, isn't he? Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you then, and you can start your session. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it into IRC. We're currently on the Freenode channel or pound virtual jug, depending on if you're on this side of the pond or the other. And I'll pose any questions to Samir either during or at the end of the session. So this session is going to be around 30 minutes, I believe. So without further ado, over to you, Samir.
All right, cheers. 30 minutes is a rough guess. It may be longer, it may be shorter, depending on how nervous I get and how fast I talk. So let's see how that goes. So here we go. The talk title is Highly Strung. Kind of about how you should understand your type system, but really it's just about using your type system so you don't get bitten in the butt. So first of all, a little bit about me. I am, and I quote, one of the most talented ranters Chris knows. He said this about 20 minutes ago, or 15 minutes ago when I said I was nervous. So there you go. I like ranting, and this is mostly a rant. But it has a lot of code involved. So if you like rants that are supported by evidence, then this may or may not be up your street. Let's see how it goes. The point of this talk is that strings are terrifying. I don't really know how to go into much more detail. I will explain, but first I want to talk about exactly what a string is. So in the Java world and the C# world and Ruby, actually not Ruby, Ruby's a ridiculous language, but in most high-level programming languages, a string is really just an immutable character array, not a byte array, but a character array. The difference is that often each character can be multiple bytes, and in Java, as you may know, we use the UTF-16 character set, so it's each character is 2 or more bytes. Sometimes it's 3, and it's prefixed by the length of the string. And I'm pretty sure I counted that as 18, although I might be wrong. Am I coming through to everyone, by the way? Can I get a thumbs up or something? Maybe not.
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. I can.
Excellent. Okay, that's good to hear. I just realised I'm talking to my computer and I get no feedback whether anyone can hear me. And people are just going to think I'm a crazy person. People already think I'm a crazy person, more of a crazy person. So this is what a string is, but really I'm not that concerned about what it is. I'm concerned about what it does and what it's... Oh, I'm missing a slide. Here we go. So this is what a string does. Like it holds text for people, right? You can put pretty much anything you want into a string. It's of any length, as many characters you want, assuming you have that much memory. You could put the entire works of Shakespeare into a string, and it would take approximately 12 megabytes. It's not a lot. You can pack a lot of information into a modern computer string. But mostly, we don't use them for this. We use them for computers. Like we use strings as a way for computers to communicate with each other. So, this is a snippet of XML that I made up. And you'll see that most of it is actually intended for a computer to read out. And there's only a few bits of information in there for people. Like the title and the author, that's for people. The genre probably is used more by the computer than human being. The ISBN definitely is. And all of the XML tags and the attributes and the header and all that stuff, that's all for the computer. It's not for the human being. Eventually, this is going to be useful to a human, but actually, it's going to probably go through a lot of processing, a lot of XML. And there's a lot more computer-generated strings, computer-read strings, than there are human-based strings, because we just can't pump out that much XML by typing, right? You've got to make a computer do it. And for some reason, we do love pumping out XML and JSON. It's one of our favorite things to do as programmers. So, that seems cool. What's the problem? So I don't have an issue with strings themselves. I think they're very useful. They're a great way to send data around, create a common character set, and away you go. The problem, I have a couple problems with the way they're used. The first one looks like this. So you have A plus B. That's the concatenation operator for those of you who don't know Java. I'm assuming most of you do. Let's assume A and B are strings. What that's doing is taking two strings and slamming them together with really no thought for what's in the strings. And the second one looks like that. So this is doing the opposite. It's splitting a string based on some criteria. And these two things together make up, most of the problems with strings in my mind. So that might sound weird. Like if you can't join them or split them, what can you do with them? So let's just go through a bunch of code and we'll see how this goes. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is single responsibility. This is a serialization function. It loops through a list of whatnots. Don't ask me why I wrote that. Converts them to strings, sticks them together, and puts commas in between. And I know that's true because I wrote this piece of code. I didn't compile it, so it may not compile, but I wrote it. If I hadn't told you, it would have probably taken you 30 seconds to a minute to figure that out, assuming no one had bugged you in the meantime and you could focus and you had your cup of coffee for the day, or 17th cup of coffee for the day, depending on what time it is, and how much coffee you drink. For me, it's more like 17. This is, it does the job, but it could be a little better. We've got a Boolean that we flip for, in a loop in an if statement. It's a bit confusing, right? So it's kind of doing two things, right? It's converting everything to a string, and then it's joining them together, and it's three things really, because it's also remembering whether it's got the first thing or not. And so let's break that into two things first of all. So the first part of this function now is the code readable? I should probably ask. Someone flag me if it's not. The first part of the code turns everything into strings. The second part outputs it, and we extract it a constant as well for fun. That's nice, and actually it's a lot more code. We had 11 lines of code beforehand. Now we're up to about 16 or 17. That's not so good, but there's a reason for that, because now we have two things that are completely that are not related in terms of their in terms of any data that's shared, so we can pass them around, which means I can extract a couple of methods from here. So we take one thing which turns everything to a string, and then the second thing joins them. And so my serialize function now is two things, and now I have two pieces of infrastructure code which actually do the monkey work. And then I can just extract those out entirely. And there's a couple things I want to highlight here. The first thing is that strings make it quite, if we're just dealing with strings everywhere, they make it quite difficult to identify which pieces of code are doing what. It looks like and it's very easy to munge everything together, just like this. You know, we're doing two things, but we treat them as one operation. But also that actually most of this code is boring, right? It doesn't really have anything to do with our domain. It's just, you know, a bit of infrastructure code. The interesting things in our code are here. We want to join these values, and we want to use this separator to do them, and that's the piece of work we're actually interested in doing. And we can ship the rest into the infrastructure layer of our code, because strings often are just infrastructure, right? And we store things as rich objects with, you know, nice methods on them, and sometimes some getters, and if you want to make me cry, you put setters on there too. We don't. Well, strings are kind of a catch-all. It just kind of can be anything, and what we generally use is for data transmission. So we want to serialize to a string for data transmission. That's great, but that's really infrastructure work. It's nothing to do with the day-to-day work of our system, and especially constructing that string. It's a bit boring, and we can do things in a better way. Okay.
Just to interrupt, sorry, Samir.
Yeah.
The font size looks on the large okay, but would you mind just changing it slightly just to make it a tiny bit bigger?
Yeah, we can bump it up like that.
That's perfect.
Great things aren't working in a browser, right? You just hit the button. This was Simon's idea, by the way. I take no credit for it. Okay, so that's kind of one example of how we can not necessarily avoid strings, but just kind of remember that the complex bits around them we can just move somewhere else. There's another thing I want to talk about. So let's talk about CSV files, because they're one of my favorite things, because I work in a financial organization right now. I'm consulting for a financial organization, and they have CSVs everywhere, or sometimes tab-separated files, or sometimes they're not entirely sure which ones they are, and you have to go figure it out. So here's some Java 8 code, because if I wrote the Java 7 code, we'd be here all day, that takes a file, reads lines from it, splits those lines by comma because it's a CSV file, and then constructs a new toolbox object, then filters out the code that filters out the toolboxes that do not have spanners. It filters out the toolboxes that don't have spanners. Toolbox in, I think. So that's nice. It's quite a simple piece of code, and it's just ripping it. It's kind of just constructing the things that we need, filtering them out, and it's only a few lines of code, right? It's fairly easy to read. Kind of, yes, but it's more complicated than that, because CSVs aren't simple. So we're splitting by comma, but what if there's a comma in one of the fields? Well, what would we usually do with that? We quote it, right? So now we have to process the quotes and stuff. So I've extracted this out into a split line method because it was going to get hairy. And you can see how hairy it is, right? This is just dealing with quotes. And I'm sure you can do this a little better. I just kind of knocked this out. It's not tested, by the way. I didn't run it. I don't even know if it compiles. But this is just kind of the code I thought I'd have to write when I'm dealing with CSV files and CSV fields that are quoted, because you have to also make sure that the quotes are at the start and the end and not halfway in between. And please don't try and read this code, because I did just knock it out, and I'm pretty sure it doesn't even work. It's just a kind of an example of why I want to avoid this. And of course, we didn't even cover escaped quotes, because of course you can have a quote in a quoted string or a quote in an unquoted string, and you have to be able to escape that. And don't forget that CSV files, a field can have a new line, right? Because it's text, it's a string, it can be anything. A field could have a new line character in it. So reading by line, splitting the file by line is not going to work, because quite often a field can span a line, especially if it's quoted. Like, well, the way to handle that is by quoting. And really, what I'm trying to avoid here, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to do this. But the part of the problem is that, if you recall, we're splitting the lines and then we're just mapping them straight onto fields, those fields straight onto new toolbox objects, and then do the filtering, and it's all kind of in one place. So what if it wasn't? What if we just provided a stream of listed strings and then put our logic into another class called CSV Reader? And honestly, I don't like the name of this class that well, but it's way better than the original, which was Toolbox, and it was worrying about reading toolboxes. But really, we just care about CSV files here, because this way, now that I've pushed it out to my to another class, the code that I use to just deal with the the actual behavior of filtering out the right objects can go somewhere else. And then when I realized I have no idea how to process CSV files without writing a hell of a lot of bugs, because it turns out it's very complicated, I can just replace all this code with one library and keep my interface the same. And then I can avoid actually working with strings at all and just let other people do it. Because, again, it's infrastructure. And why are we doing this as part of our domain code to actually read our domain objects? All right, I want to go into a third thing. So I want to talk about also reducing your exposure. So let's focus on the method signature here. We've got a method called containing tool. It takes a tool name, and then eventually it will actually go and get you a toolbox that contains that tool. Of course, it has to check whether the string is empty, and it has to make sure it's in the list of valid tools, or set of valid tools, and then it can go do its thing, right? And if I have lots of code that deals with tool names and tools, I'm probably going to have to sprinkle this sort of thing everywhere. And quite often, a thing we end up copying and pasting code all over the place, or extracting static helper methods just to deal with strings constantly. So I'm going to propose a slightly better signature. It looks like that. So instead of containing tool name, we just say containing and then give it a tool. This reduces our exposure to everything. So because a string really can be anything, right? It's just a set of characters. And by just saying exactly what we expect, we're expecting a tool. It gives us a bunch of advantages. So let's see. The first thing really is that we've moved the error checking somewhere else. So we have these 5 lines of error checking, which were probably duplicated all over the place. We could just move them as a constructor for tool, or if it's an enum, then we don't even have to do that. Or we can move it into the thing that constructs it, and have one place that just handles taking the name and retrieving the right tool object, and then worry about the toolbox separately. But it also makes it really obvious to people using it that exactly what we accept. They don't have to worry about what case the string should be, what language it should be in, because it's not obvious, right? A lot of us work in English constantly, but for people working in other countries who quite often are flipping between English and their native language, even in their code bases, it's not obvious from the method signature, if it's just taking a string, what language that should even be in. And we know there's probably a fixed set here. Either it's going to be an enumeration or it's going to be stored in a database somewhere. We're not going to just make new ones on the fly at random. So why can't we just have a class or an enum that just holds all these things? It also means that this is far more extensible. So if I wanted in this class to also take into account the color of the tool or the weight of the tool when retrieving the right box full of tools, I'd have to add new things to the parameter list, which means I have to change everything that calls it to accommodate it. With this one, I just add them to the tool class itself, and then nothing that calls this deals with it. Only the things that have to care about those things needs to change, and everything else can just pass the objects around. Okay, at this point, I want to ask if there's any questions so far. So I am not on the chat room.
Okay, so yeah, I've just been looking in the chat room. I've just asked nothing so far, so we're good to carry on. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Right, where was I? So that's more about readability and structure of your code and designing your code. But actually, the thing that inspired me to write this talk and write these slides was more on correctness. So I want to ask a question for the group, and I'm happy for it to take a little while. I know there's a bit of a lag. Does anyone see any issues with this code? And if you say it's not using string format, you get a demerit.
Okay, so I'm just putting the question in the chat. Let me just add this. You're not going to give any hints at all, right?
No hints at all. I'm sure a lot of people know this one because it usually is something that in your first week of programming something, that's going to help a lot. Usually it's a thing that someone slaps you on the wrist for in your first week of programming and you never do it again. So I'm hoping most people know the answer to this one, but I want to hear it.
Okay, so Carl has said, is it an SQL injection attack?
Exactly. Yes, thank you.
This is the classic Bobby Tables, right?
It is the classic Bobby Tables. I didn't pull up that, but you know, I'm in a web browser. Let's make this happen.
This is like one of my favorite XKCDs.
Did you really name your son Robert, quote, close bracket, semicolon, drop table student, semicolon, dash dash? Yeah, and it destroyed the student records, allegedly. So that's exactly what we're looking at here. And this is my real issue with string concatenation, is with this, strings can literally be anything. We don't know what they're going to be. So if I gave that string, made the password quote or quote quote equals quote, this is what will happen. And I've got the SQL up here. We end up with this, where username equals hacker and password equals quote or quote equals quote. We have a couple of Boolean operators here, so let's put some brackets around them. So where the username and the password equal these things, or double quote equals double quote, or empty string equals empty string, and I'm pretty sure that's always true. So what's the SQL going to say? It's essentially saying select everything from the users, and then we check whether it's 1. And actually, it was supposed to be greater than 1. There's a bug in my code. That would actually prevent it. So if I made that greater 1, or I can make the SQL injection slightly different.
Well, this is one of the great things, Samir, about asking a group of geeks what's wrong with this code. We've got loads of information now. So SQL is string, no binds, SQL injection tastic.
Yeah.
Too much exposed how authentication is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Some tables would change after refactoring, so you could lose maintainability.
Oh, yeah.
Shouldn't store passwords as strings. It should be a prepared statement. This is great.
All right, so here we go. So here's our prepared statement, and I agree that you probably shouldn't store your password in a string, but it could have been a byte array, and we'd have the same problem. To be honest, it just goes better with the title of the talk. The real problem here, one of the real problems here, probably the most serious problem here, and I agree with all of those other problems that people highlighted, is that we're just munging strings together with no thought about what could possibly be in them. So if we prepare our statement, we put question marks in and then set those strings up and then execute our query, what's happening under the hood is your database is compiling that SQL. It's turning it into an abstract syntax tree and then executing that syntax tree. So when we use a prepared statement, the insertion of our variables, the username and hash password in this case, is that it happens after we prepare that syntax tree, and after actually it probably goes into a lot, probably compiles it a lot more and turns it into, and runs an explain plan and does all sorts of other clever things that database developers know how to do and I don't. The most important thing it's doing is it's definitely not sticking strings together, right? It's inserting strings into object graphs at this point. And if you put a string into an object, it's probably going to stay exactly the same. You're not going to start concatenating things and putting quotes in weird places. Just by using real objects, in this case a prepared statement, I think the data type there is wrong. I think it might actually have to be prepared statement. Oh well. Just by using a prepared statement rather than just sticking strings together, we've saved ourselves we've not only made our code a little bit clearer about what exactly is happening, but we've saved ourselves from being bitten completely by anyone who knows how to exploit websites and get us to run arbitrary SQL. So, all right, so that's one way in which concatenation causes problems. I want to show you another way now. So sometimes it's just we have too much to think about. So here's some HTML, and I'm using Freemarker, which is a very popular templating library in the Java world, to run through a list of books and spit out HTML that corresponds to those books. It's kind of similar to the XML we saw earlier, but not quite. This so this is a templating library, so we haven't got the same problem we had before. We're just concatenating arbitrary strings, or do we? So this, I put in some book reviews because that made my life easier. So we have a list of book reviews, we loop through them, we spit out the text and the reviewer name. So what if the text of the book review looks something like that? So what this will do is add that as text into our HTML. And it will just insert it as is. It's not going to do any crazy escaping because you didn't ask it to. So we're going to have a script tag which sets the document location to install.malware.com. That's not a real website. I'm tempted to register it, but it doesn't exist yet. And so that's fun. That's going to be, that's just, you know, we're going to have a bad time. Or we're going to end up redirecting all of our users to a malware site. Google's going to block us and demote us from our search rankings. And if we, why does this keep jumping around? Where are we? I've got to stop clicking things at random. I'm really good at clicking things at random. So we're gonna have a bad time where all our users go to a malware site and get infected. Google catches us, removes our site from search listings, makes Chrome block us, and you know, in general, if you were relying on ad revenue, you're not anymore. So that's a bad thing. What can we do about it? Well, we can put $HTML after everything, and Freemarker will go and HTML escape everything, and that's really nice of it. And don't forget to do it in all the other HTML you have, and I'm assuming you have thousands upon thousands of lines of HTML because everyone does. And if you miss one of these, just one, where it's user input, you know, it's user editable data, a bot will find it because people have written bots to do this, and it will stick random HTML and JavaScript into your code and just, you know, really, really upset your users. So what else can we do about it? Because that's clearly not, well, it's not a great solution. It's going to cause us problems as soon as we miss a single one, and there's no way of catching it because your compiler's not going to tell you if you missed that. I guess you could write some kind of a static analyzer to do it yourself, but I mean, in that case, you know, what if you actually want to embed some HTML like this? You know, then you have to go turn it off. Basically, we're going to have a bad time. So let's avoid that. So instead, how about this? This probably makes no sense to anyone, and it shouldn't because I made these functions up. So let's talk through it. I'm going to show you, I wish I put it on the same slide rather than a different one, the signature of the section tag. It looks like this. So section takes a varargs of nodes, and where node is an interface that has one method which is called toXML. XML, HTML, I'm assuming are roughly the same for this purpose of this argument, for the purpose of this discussion. So a section returns a node, and it takes lots of nodes. ID returns a node, and we have three implementations of node. We have element, attribute, and text. So class name returns an attribute, ID returns an attribute, text, I don't even know what I just did. Text returns a text node, span returns an element. You get the idea, right? And all of these work in exactly the same way. So now I just have three implementations of toXML to implement, and I make sure the text one escapes HTML, and I write a lot of unit tests up front, TDD them, make sure that's going to happen. Oh, and by the way, many takes a list of nodes and turns them into a single node. So that's great. Oh, that's probably a fourth case of node, to be honest. So that's nice. Then we have three implementations of toXML, and it doesn't matter how much stuff we do, we're going to be using one of those three implementations, and we know they work well together. So, and by the way, this library doesn't exist, but if you want it, I will write it for you because I really wish we were doing this instead of using templating libraries. Because templating libraries are horrible, horrible, horrible things. For, not just for HTML, but also for other things. Anytime you're just munging text together, you can. It may not cause a security vulnerability like it does here, but at the very least, it can break your XML. You know, for example, people just putting errant. If people put a less than sign in their text, your HTML will break. Sometimes browsers are good at compensating. Sometimes they're not. It really depends on the HTML itself. I want to give you a real-world example now because this I made up, right? Although I did actually run this, and it does break stuff. It's quite funny. Here's a real-world example. This one's in JavaScript. So this was a tweet that was retweeted 75,000 times, and it was posted on the 11th of July. And what it did was exploit a vulnerability in Tweetdeck when you use emoji, so that's why that little heart is there, where it just kind of stuck some HTML inside Tweetdeck. And what this does is it creates something with a class of XSS, and it finds the parent element, which is the tweet holder essentially, gets the first link and clicks it. And and I can't remember what the first link is, but the next thing is also interesting. And then it finds the retweet button and it clicks that too. Oh, that's right. The first link loads it up in your editor. The second link clicks the retweet button, and then the third thing it does is pop up an alert box saying there's XSS and Tweetdeck, a cross-site scripting vulnerability. This is a generic term for these things, is cross-site scripting, when you're essentially either embedding JavaScript into someone else's web page or using some kind of security vulnerability to make it load JavaScript from an entirely different website. That's why it's called cross-site scripting, because you're loading JavaScript from someone else's site without your knowledge. This was retweeted 75,000 times because it retweeted itself 75,000 times, which I thought was quite impressive. And of course, we're not counting anyone who just unretweeted afterwards. And it was very benign. You know, all it did was retweet itself and then told you there was a bug in TweetDeck. And I guess the reason it didn't explain more is because you can only get 140 characters in a tweet. And I think that was pretty cool. And I'm really glad it was benign, and because it brought it to the developers of TweetDeck's attention immediately, and they fixed it very quickly, and they actually took down TweetDeck in the meantime, which is very responsible of them, but really annoyed a lot of people. And it was hard to catch because it only happens if you put emoji in a tweet, like a happy face or a heart or whatever it might be. It doesn't, and that's because Twitter recently added support for emoji, actually, quite recently. And I guess it wasn't tested nearly as well because they were probably rushing to get it in, because that's usually how these things go, right? So what was really happening was this snippet of code, right? We are passing, if we had emoji, this was in a big block of code that was checking for emoji, it just set the inner HTML, and inner HTML really is a dangerous thing to be setting, and it's the same problem we had earlier. We're just setting the HTML to something that was provided by the user, and anytime you have user input, it's unsafe, right? You just can't have it. So this was the code beforehand. Afterwards, they just deleted this code entirely. They actually disabled emoji for a little while until they could get this bug sorted out, which was a pretty quick solution and probably the sensible way to go. And because it was only happening on reading, not on writing, it didn't cause any lasting effects. So, I mean, I think they did a good thing, but I wish this hadn't happened in the first place. And if they just set the text content attribute or the inner text attribute, depending on which browser, this would not have been a problem. It would just have... It would, and the issue really is the emoji parser spits out a combination of free text and HTML, and they kind of trusted their own code too much. They didn't consider that they might not be escaping all the HTML correctly, and actually they didn't escape it at all in this one particular piece of code flow among many. So that was fun. That was a really interesting bug, which caused me to run around to my computers and make sure Tweetdeck was closed. And there we go. So this is all pretty awful, but I'm not really giving you. Maybe I hope I'm not just scaring you. I'm also giving you things to think about and ways to get around this. So the problem. Let's talk about the problem before we talk about the solution. I just want to sum everything up. Misuse of strings can lead to quite bad software design, which is never fun. Quite often, it leaves us coupling infrastructure to business logic, and that makes your code pretty hard to test, makes it hard to maintain. Personally, I think strings are infrastructure level things, and that they should only go into constructors and come out of things when being serialized for some other system. As long as you're in your own system, you should never be passing a string to a method. It should always be wrapped first. And it should be wrapped as early as possible as soon as that user input comes in. And if it's not user input, then why is it a string? As long as it's still in memory. I mean, if you have to write to a file and then read it out later, or write it to the database, read it out later, you're going to get strings out. The first thing you should be doing is converting them into something and validating and doing any security checks or validation or verification checks immediately and in one place. But I think the more scary thing is that strings stop us from guaranteeing correctness. And this is part of the same issue, but really it's a much bigger problem. Types can be a little scary, especially if you have to go write that thing that wraps the string and then puts a getter in, and then you have to put new X everywhere instead of just passing the string around. And it doesn't really have to go everywhere though. That only happens in the interim, and then it's only in one place. You just construct it in one place, and then you're good to go. But it doesn't matter how scary they are. Types are really important because they protect us from the unknown, and that's a far more important thing than just worrying about prettiness. It's not just about design, it's also about making sure your code doesn't get exploited by some hacker in, I don't know, country X. I was going to say China, and I thought that sounds actually a little bit racist. So now I'm going to say Scotland, to piss off all my friends in Scotland. So if some hacker from Scotland wants to break into your site and delete all your data, or maybe they actually want to rip out a bunch of information for their own purposes, maybe customer data, could be a corporate espionage. There's so many reasons someone might want to get into your data, get into your data, and it's so easy for them to do if you're just passing around strings everywhere and sticking them together and breaking them apart. It just causes a lot of problems. So the solution is just to use your type system, right? Don't expose the string until you really have to, and make sure it's validated as soon as it comes into your system. Don't concatenate things at all if you can avoid it, and if you do have to concatenate things or split things, just put them in one single place. It's not just a question of design in terms of the method signatures, but it also helps us reuse code. If you find yourself sprinkling static methods all over the place, it's probably because your types aren't letting you put the logic in the right place. Rather than having a tool name, why not create a tool object and put the behavior on there? And you quite often find that you don't need getters at all at that point, and you just have methods that do things rather than methods that rip data out. And you end up with very object-oriented code. And an object-oriented language like Java, that's really nice. So if you have a decent separation between your business logic and infrastructure code, just put the strings in the infrastructure, wrap your strings, put them in the infrastructure layer, and then don't expose them. I introduced this in one job, and it scared the hell out of everyone for a long time until they finished, until there were no more strings, and then everything was so nice. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. All right. Thank you very much. That was a rant, and I hope you enjoyed it. I want to ask if there are any more questions, or any questions, actually. We didn't get any the first time around.
Okay, so I'm just asking in the chat now. What would you say? Were there any downsides, Samir, too, when you do take strings out and effectively objectify them? Any downsides in terms of performance or anything like that? Would you say?
The performance problems are generally elsewhere in your code, I find. Shall I turn the screen share off?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, the performance problems I find are generally everywhere else. They're generally because of algorithmic problems, or because you're converting stuff from a list to set and then back to and then to a map and then back to a list, or things like that. It's to do with usually because your code is too obfuscated to understand why it's doing what it's doing. And actually, I think it helps with performance half the time. I don't have any numbers on that, but just anecdotally, I found I've improved performance by wrapping my primitives, my strings, my lists, my integers, because it made it really obvious where to put some code, and then I find out a lot of conversion code goes away.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so no questions coming through at the moment.
Okay. I realise it was probably just a very long rant, and tuned out halfway through, but I enjoyed it, so that's probably okay.
I think a good rant leaves everybody stunned, right?
Yeah.
They're thinking of the implications.
Yeah, that, or they just got bored. So what I'll do is I'll mention our next topic is going to be around TDD, I believe, and I just haven't put that on the site yet because we're having a couple of interesting problems with our site at the moment, but hopefully that'll be fixed this week. Right, a couple of questions in. One from Allegro Jazz. Sounds like a cool name. I'm not familiar at all with the other JVM languages, but is this issue related to all JVM languages, Scala, etc., or some of them have an internal workaround? So I guess, I mean, we can go beyond JVM languages as well, right? This is.
So in I wonder if I can just get up the text editor so I can explain a little better rather than just trying to talk code, because that's never fun. Let me see. Let's just. In Clojure, they've got a really nice way of doing things. All the XML libraries, because Clojure generally you just work with maps, you don't work with typed objects, you work with essentially untyped objects. I can't remember the exact syntax, but essentially it basically looks like you create an object which is, let's see, you have a tag, and then you have a tag name which is, I don't know, book, and it's something like this. I'm probably getting it wrong, but and then that's the key value pairs, so it can be ID book 1. So I have another inside it. So you're working with, you don't write XML, and you're not working with template, and you're working with data structures. And when you're working with data structures, and you're generally not concatenating things together, you're working with rich objects, and you only stick things together at the last possible moment. Otherwise, you're just dealing with object graphs and putting things in the right place. In Scala, I'd say it's got a couple of advantages. First of all, is you have the case classes, a string. Is it easy as that? So, and if then that's only there at compile time, and at runtime it just makes it a string again, which is lovely. The other thing Scala's pretty useful for is you are dealing with XML specifically. XML is a first-class thing, which is really bizarre, but it's really helped me in a couple of situations. So, ID equals, I think the syntax is something like, and that is not concatenating strings. It is creating XML node objects and serializing them later. So what?
I think your voice is cutting out because of the typing. So
okay, sorry. So in Scala, that is sorry, but that is an XML element object. It's not a string, and there's no string concatenation happening until you ask it to convert itself to a string. So all the string concatenation happens in exactly one place, written by the Scala devs, and you can probably assume they tested it and knew what they were doing.
Okay, awesome. Another question from Jankrag. Does this, or he says doesn't, but does this approach limit code reuse?
I have found mostly the opposite, because what it means is the code that deals with your infrastructure concerns is reused in a very different way from the code that deals with your business logic, and they tend to change at different rates. So by moving all the string stuff into your infrastructure layer, if you have an infrastructure layer, and if you don't, consider one, please. I know Sandro likes banging on about it a lot, so now I have to start pushing it too, because he's my boss. He'll get upset if I don't. What was his talk on last time? Was it on
refactoring and testing legacy code? Yeah.
Okay, right. He started. I was wondering if he gave a talk a couple of weeks ago about separation of core and infrastructure, which I think is worth checking out. I believe it's on YouTube. It's called interaction-driven design.
Cool.
What was the question? There was a question. I totally got derailed.
The question was, does it limit reuse? Does this approach limit code reuse?
What I find is the code I want to reuse for infrastructural purposes and the code I want to reuse for business purposes tend to happen, they tend to not be, those things can be quite different. So by wrapping my strings, I actually find that I can reuse code, for example, that CSV reader, right? Just extract it out, put it somewhere else, and then we can reuse it for any other CSV files we've got. That kind of thing is what I was going for, is actually more code reuse. And then the code, the reuse of business logic, you just put those as methods on your objects, because you've created a ton more classes now at this point, right? And the methods just have a place to go. Corey Haynes calls these behavior extractors. as soon as you create a class, you find it attracts behavior that was previously in a method elsewhere and probably in the wrong place. And then you end up reusing that.
Okay, got another question from, this one's from Carl, and this is really about, I guess, future maintenance of your code when you use this technique. Does removing strings in favor of more concrete types make it easier to add new attributes to the objects later without changing the APIs that use the code?
It really depends, because like the goal, in my mind, when writing maintainable code is to write code that is easy to change. But of course, there's many dimensions, and you can generally not hit them all, right? So you write code that's easy to change along a few dimensions. And if you're really good at your job, way better than me, you can predict those dimensions accurately. But mostly we just go with guesses, right? We guess that, oh, last time we worked on this, the input formats changed all the time, but the actual pipeline changed not much, and the web pages stayed roughly the same. We didn't change CSS, so I'll optimize for that. But so I find that yes, with caveats, I don't think it's ever going to make it worse. I find that even wrapping a single string, generally, I've just by putting that into my type system, I save a lot of time later when I want to add a new thing. And I actually did it this morning. I turned a collection of objects into its own data type for exactly the same reason, because I knew later this week I'm going to have to, I'm probably going to be adding more stuff that deals with this collection. I know later this week that collection type is probably going to change from a list to a map. So if I wrap it, I only have to change it in one place. And it's the same with strings. Just by wrapping it, we save ourselves a lot of time ahead of time. If you never change your code, then it probably is a waste of time. But I've never worked on a successful code base that we don't change the code all the time, and the requirements don't keep changing. So if you know your requirements ahead of time, then it's much easier to say yes or no. But I think if you don't know your requirements ahead of time, it's actually more important to do stuff like this, because it does make life easier in the long run.
Cool. How are you with your design patterns knowledge? Pretty good, or?
Okay.
Okay, let's try this one. Question from Allegro Jazz. If we wrap strings, aren't we losing the benefit of the flyweight design pattern?
Flyweight design pattern is the one where you kind of reuse code as much as possible, reuse objects as much as possible, right?
That's a great question. I'm not sure myself.
Okay. I'm going to Google this while I fill in with some talking.
I'll join you.
Hold on. I think I know what it is. Yeah, so you're minimizing memory use by sharing as much data as possible with other objects. That's the Wikipedia definition anyway. You can share the strings if you want. I mean, you can always just provide the guesser, but I've never had to use the flyweight design pattern, so it's really hard for me to say. I would say that if you're really worried about performance, some of these techniques aren't going to be for you. Just bear in mind that premature optimization is the root of all evil. But if you do need to optimize, and you do need to start getting rid of some wrapper types and things like that to make through the optimization, then fair enough. Just make sure that's where your bottleneck is. And call Martin Verber, because he knows a lot more about this than me.
Awesome. Okay, that's pretty much all our questions dealt with. So, Samir, it was a pleasure having you on the VJug.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Hey, no problem at all, no problem. And if you ever wanted to use some of Samir's services, you're welcome to go to Codurance and pay what I'm sure is a very, very good price for some awesome code which Sandra and yourself can create.
Our goal is, you save a lot of money in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely.
The crazy things over and over again, and you're not having to rewrite the same code over and over again. That's our goal. So at Codurance, what we do is we are a software craftsmanship consultancy. What that means is we try and build software craftsmanship principles such as maintenance, reusability, things like that, into we try and help other teams realize those in their own code bases, either by training or consulting or embedding someone in their team, that kind of thing. And so this sort of thing is the stuff I really enjoy doing. I like just taking a piece of code where it's kind of all over the place and splitting out its concerns and putting the types in, so that later it may look like a bit more code in the short term, but later in the long term it's going to pay off in dividends. I think it almost always does.
Well, that sounds Awesome. So yeah, I'll announce when our next session is, which is probably going to be in a couple of weeks, and that'll be Colin Vipers, so another guy from the UK. Seems to be using up all my contacts, and we'll join again as the VJug in a couple of weeks. So thanks, Samir. Anything to add, Oliver? Yeah, absolutely.
Colin is probably the most knowledgeable person about testing I've ever met, so you really should listen to that.
Yeah, Colin's awesome, and I love his TDD discussions. He always goes on about, do you really do TDD? No, do you really do TDD? So yeah, Colin's very straight on his TDD methodology. Awesome. So everyone's saying thank you in the chat. So let me add my thanks to that as well. And thanks for an awesome VJug session. Anything to add, Oliver?
I don't actually have an IRC.
Nothing for me. Thanks a lot, Samir. It's great to see you, and I really enjoyed your rant. It was incredibly entertaining.
Excellent. I'm really glad to hear it. If you wanna catch me and ask me any questions or have a chat, then I'm at Samir Talwar on Twitter, and I'm always up for chatting to people.
Okay, awesome. I'll add that directly into the IRC chat.
And on the meetup, I'll post a link to my slides and all my notes.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, and thanks for joining us. Cheers. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys. See you next time.